Okay, so I want to go ahead and cover some important syntax that you'll be working on, or you might come across when you're doing some research on how to do certain things. So I'll be talking about certain ways to print. There's a traditional print statement. There's like an old way and there's a new way. So I'll be covering that. And then also I'll be talking about some of the operations related to strings as well as lists. So let's go ahead and get started. I have a Jupyter notebook and I'm just going to be going through each of these cells one at a time. So cell number one says define a variable, right? So define var1 and assign it to the string value hello. And then here it says define var2 and assign it the string value MIS433. And this should have a quote. And then it says print the two variables in one function separated by a comma. So let's go ahead and just tackle this one at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable. So my defined variable is going to be var1 and it's going to have a string value hello. And then var2 is going to have the string value MIS433. And here it says print the two variables in one print function separated by a comma. So I will say print, and then inside the parentheses, what I'm going to do is put the variable names. So var1 and then comma var2. And when I run this, this is what the output will look like. All right, so when you're using print functions, you could put like the string literal. I can put the actual string hello in quotes inside this print function, or I can also put variables inside the print function. Notice when I'm putting variables inside the print function, I'm not putting any sort of quotes in them. Right, so that's how you would print number one when you're dealing with multiple variables and you want to put them in the print function. You could separate them by commas, right? Now for number two, it says use the same print statement but include the separator argument. So if you recall, there's a help function where it can give us some documentation about certain information. In this case, I want to get help information about the print function. So I'm going to hit enter, control enter on my keyboard, and this is what the documentation says about the print function. So a print function has different types of information that you can put in it. So you have the value. So in our case, it would be like variable 1, variable 2, but then you can also include additional pieces of information. We call these different types of arguments. So here we have an argument called SEP and an equal sign, and it has a single quotes. And this is the default here. So what it's doing is whenever we print information, what it's going to do as a separator is it's going to place a space between the two values. And you can see that here in number one, where we put var1, var2, and we separate them by a comma, and the output happened to be the values that are in these variables separated by a space. So this is something that you can change, but you would have to explicitly mention this inside your print function. So I'm going to go ahead and do that in number two. So what I'll do is I'll just copy the same print statement and put it in this cell. And I will hit the comma and put SEP equals. And then inside quotes, I'm going to put I believe that's a backslash n. And this means that I want to separate the information in the next variable in the next line. So let me go ahead and run this. What ends up happening is it first prints out hello, goes off to the next line, then prints out MIS433, right? So that's how you would use an argument within the print function. So here I'm using different arguments by putting values, putting two variables, and then hit comma, put the argument SEP, and it will change from the default, which happens to be a space, to the next line. If I want, I could also say maybe dash dash inside the separator, run it, and this would be the output. Okay, for number 3, we have print the following output, hello world and MIS433 by using the f-string technique and var2. So one thing you need to keep in mind is in number 2, I went ahead and used a print statement and called variable 1 and variable 2 because I know it's already in memory based off of my run in number 1. So I'm going to do the same thing in number 3. I'm going to be using the same variables that I've created, and I'm going to use something called the f-string technique. And I've provided some documentation in case you want more information, and it's coming from the realpython.com website on how to use these different techniques. Now, let's go ahead and write this. So I'm going to use a print statement, and to use the f-string technique, what you'll do is within the parentheses, the first thing that you would do is hit the F button followed by a single quote. And in here, you can put anything that you want that's a string. So if I say something like hello world and put the ampersand, ampersand, I think is how you say it. And I can put some more information that I want. It's all going to be part of a string. That's going to be the output. Now, whenever you use the f-string, you can also use something called placeholders. And how placeholders work, you would use these curly brackets, and then inside these curly brackets you put whatever type of information that you would like. So in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the variable 2 inside this placeholder. So I'll put var2 because I know it's created from my example, my very first example here. So when I want to finish off my string, what I'll do is I will end it with another single quote, and then I'm going to go ahead and run the information. So let me see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control Enter, and you'll see the output here. It says hello world, and we have the and MIS433. So it's printing out a string, and then we have this placeholder, and we're indicating a variable that we've already defined, and it's outputting that all together in a print statement. This is how you would use the f-string technique, and you're using placeholders and calling variables. Going into number 4, this one's a little bit of an older technique, but it's still considered to be one of the newer ways, and it's using the format method on a string. So let's go ahead and demonstrate this. We're going to say print, and I'll say welcome, and in comparison to what I did previously, I didn't write F and followed by a single quote. I went ahead and opened up a string, and then I'm putting whatever kind of value that I want in between these quotations, and I'm going to place an empty placeholder. I'm not going to put anything inside of it. I'm not going to put the variable 2 like I did previously. I'm just going to leave this placeholder empty. Okay, and what I'll do is put an exclamation mark after the placeholder, and then at the end of the quotations, what I'll do is use the .format method and open up the parentheses and then type in the variable. So by doing this, I have the welcome message, and then I want to put MIS433 inside this placeholder. Similar to how I did it previously with the f string, but it's outputting a different type of string, obviously. So I'm going to go ahead and hit run, and this is the output: welcome MIS433 exclamation mark. Again, this is different from the f string method, where the f string you would include the variable inside the placeholder, but you would have to begin your print statement with an f followed by a single quote and then end it with a single quote. Here we're not dealing with an f, we're just putting everything inside a string, and then at the end of the string we put a .format, inside parentheses we put the variable. So that's how you would use different techniques when it comes down to printing. Definitely practice this with your own set of variables and values and see what kind of output comes along. Now, again, I provided some of the documentation, and you can kind of follow along with the examples that are provided in the documentation to kind of get the hang of it. All right, so moving on to this next part. So here we're going to be dealing with string operations, and I've provided a link for more information related to the different types of operators that are involved in Python. Now we have like the arithmetic operators, such as like the plus sign, subtraction sign, multiplication sign, division sign, and all of these are used in Python depending on the data type that you're dealing with. So here we're dealing with strings. Look at an example of how you would use some of these operators. So in number 6, it says use a print function on the defined variables x equals mis and y equals 433, concatenate x and y. And then here it says note y will need to be converted to a string in the print function. So here we have the defined variables already, so I can run this so it can go into memory. And below this statement, I didn't have to run it right now. I could have waited until I finished what I want to write in terms of my code. But here it's saying to use a print function on these defined variables. So if I say print and I say something like x comma y and I try to run this, I'll have mis 433. So it actually ran. Now let's take a look at here. All right, so the way that I did this is it ended up working because I separated both of these variables by a comma. Now if I didn't use this comma and I want to use the concatenate method, the concatenation method, this involves using the plus sign, and let me go ahead and demonstrate how that would work in a print function. So instead of this comma, if I say something like this, x plus y, and if I try to run it, right, so, okay, there you go. So we get a type error, and it's pointing to where that issue is and saying that it can only concatenate a string value, not an integer. And we know that x is a string value, y is an integer. So when you're trying to say x plus y, the only way this would work is if both of these variables are the same data type. Now, so in this case, I cannot combine mis and 433 together unless I convert one of these data types. And the one that I need to change, since it's going to be in a print function, is going to be the y variable. So the way that you would tackle that is using the string conversion method. So if I say str for string, and then inside of parentheses, I have y. So I'm converting the integer of 433 into a string, putting it into the print statement, and I'm concatenating it. So let me go ahead and run this, and I have mis 433 all together. Right? So it's concatenating both of these values, but first it converts the y value into a different data type. If I wanted a space between the two of them, what I could do is inside, I'll just go ahead and open up some quotes, put a space, close quotes, and then put another plus sign, and that way it will put a space between mis and 433. So if I were to run this, now I have that space, right? So remember, initially what I ended up doing is I said x comma y, and I didn't have to worry about any sort of string conversion and so on. But sometimes you'll find that you're going to have to do some conversions of data types depending on what it is that you want to do, right? So there it is, same type of output, different type of technique, right? But here we're using the concatenation method between two strings, where we're adding two strings together, right, using the plus sign. For number 5, we're here it says print two. Let's see. I need to work on my writing a little bit, but here it says print 2, or should I say print var 1 and var 2 using the plus operator. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do exactly that. I'll say print var1, var2, and this is what the output looks like. Right, so we have hello, MIS433 all together. We talked about how to separate this by including a space in between quotes along with another plus sign. Right. For number 7, it says here, let's see, uncomment the print statement and run it. I think I might have deleted that. Say, for example, it happened to be something like this. I believe I planned on showing you var1, var2, hit enter, and you get the space, right? So it's kind of redundant of what I did in the previous couple of cells earlier. Okay. So for number 8, it says define variable myString with the value MIS433, then multiply it times 2. Okay, so we're going to have to define a variable. So that's going to be called myString, and we're putting the value MIS433 in it. All right, so that's how you define the variable along with its string value. Now it says multiply it times 2. Now, after I define it, I'm going to go ahead and say myString times 2 and see what the output looks like. So here we could use the multiplication sign, and it will just go ahead and double whatever number that follows that multiplication sign. So you could use a string as well as an integer when it comes down to dealing with the multiplication sign. Now, if I were to change this from multiplication to addition, I will get a type error. So if you're trying to add a string and an integer together, that's not going to work. You could multiply it, but you cannot add it, right? So these are some of the rules that that you have to pay attention to. And so if you get an error like this as you're trying to do some sort of operations between variables, you have to pay attention to what are the values in those variables. Here I didn't have a variable that had the value 2. Instead, I just used just the actual number, the actual integer 2, and it was able to give me the output. Okay. Going into number 9, it says define variable myString with the value MIS433, then add the string value class. Okay, so I will define the variable. It's actually defined already, so by me just doing the same thing is not really necessary just because it's up here and I know it's in memory. So what I could do is just go ahead and say myString, and I'm going to say I'm going to use the concatenation method by using that plus sign, because it says then add string value class. So here's me adding the string value class, right? I'm gonna go ahead and run this, and this is what my output looks like. Now, I don't want that space between MIS433. I need a space between 3 and C. So what I could do is just put a space right before C inside my string, run it, and that will take care of the output there. Or I could just use another plus sign and then in quotes put a space and then followed by another plus sign. That will also take care of that output as well. Right. So in number 10, it says check to see if the string value for 4 is in myString variable. So let me just go ahead and just print out myString and see what the output is. So it's MIS433. We know it's a string, and we can just say type myString to see what kind of output comes out, and it happens to be a string type of variable. Now, we want to check if the string value 4 is inside the string value MIS433. So one of those operators that we could use is the keyword in. And the way that you would do this is you would say string value of 4 in my string. I'll go ahead and delete this. And when I run it, the output says true. So I'm getting a Boolean value where it's checking to see if the value 4, and it's a string value 4, is in MIS433, which is a string value itself. And it says true. Now, if it wasn't there, it would obviously say false. And so that's how you would work with the in type of operator. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the list operations. So for number 11, it says define a list variable named my_list and include the two elements MIS and ISOM. So to create a list variable, I'm just going to go ahead and type in the myList variable as it states here to give it that name. Then I will include in brackets the different elements. So we have MIS, which is an element that is a string value, and then ISOM, which is also another string value. I'll go ahead and run it. And just to make sure, I will do a print statement to make sure it's in memory, and it is, so we're good. And now I'll move on to number 12, where it says use the defined variables course in sections. So here are the defined variables below to create a new list named new_list, where the elements are the two variables course and section. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're demonstrating how to create a list where the elements are variables instead of just strings and integers that you would just write out manually. So I'm going to create a variable called newList, open up brackets, and then my elements are going to be variable names. So I'll say course, and I'll say section for the second element. I am not going to include quotes here because what I'm doing is I'm using these defined variables as part of my list. So when I run this, what's going to happen is it's first going to assign these values into these variables, and then it's going to create a list variable where it's going to include the values that are in course as well as the values that are in section here. So let me go ahead and run it, and it's in memory, but let me print it out so you can see how the output looks like. So when I run this, this is what the output looks like. So we have MIS433, which is a string, and then we have a comma, and then the next element happens to be a list. And that list has two strings in them, 001 and 002, which are the sections for the course MIS433. So here is an example of a list where we created the list using variable names, and then when we print it out, looking at the output, we have two elements within the list. We have a string value, and then we have a list value. So if you're talking about index positions, index position 1 would be the entire list value, and index position 0 would happen to be just MIS433. So we don't have 3 elements in this new list variable. We have 2 elements, but then you can filter in and try to obtain the different values within that list. So it's a little bit more of an advanced indexing type of method that you would have to do. But know that in this list in particular, we're dealing with 2 elements, a string value and a list value. All right, so number 13, it says add the plus sign. Let's see, add the myList variables to the new list variable. So, okay, we're dealing with 2 list variables. So we have myList, and I'm going to add that to the new list. New list is defined here. We looked at the output. My list was defined up here, number 11. and that's what the output looks like. So if I try to add these two lists together using the addition sign, what's going to happen is, well, let's take a look. I'll go ahead and run it. This is what the output looks like. So we're appending the information, or concatenating that information together, right? And that's the approach that you would take. Now, since we are dealing with lists, there are particular methods that you could use with lists, such as append and extend, to add additional elements within a list. But this is another way that you could do that. Okay. And number 14, we have, it says multiply my list by 3. So let me go ahead and say my list times 3. And here, what ends up happening is the output triples. Right? So we know what kind of information is in my list, and that's up here. In number 11, there's the output. So by saying times 3, the information is tripled. Good. So in number 15, it says check to see if the element MIS is in my list variable. So similarly to how we did it in the earlier cell, I believe when we were dealing with the string in number 10, what we'll do is we'll say MIS in my list. And I'll go ahead and run this, and it says true, right? And that's pretty much how you would use the in operator, is to see if there's an identity between a value and that and the different elements within that list. Okay, so this was a very quick crash course on the different ways to print. So we looked at the traditional way of printing, but we are looking at printing using comma separated symbols in the print function. We use the F string value, the format method, and then we took a look at different ways to use the string operations as well as list operations. So give it a shot, practice this a little bit, see what the output is, and just kind of try different techniques. You don't only have to follow along with what I did here. Try to see if you can play around using the different documentation sites that I've provided here. All right, thank you.